When the new generation of consoles came out, we found that a lot of games were going to be updated and brought to the new consoles. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanx, 20 games with graphics upgrades for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Starting off at number 20 is Metro Exodus, which now runs at 60 frames per second with ray trace lighting on next gen, has 4K textures, tons of graphical improvements. To be frank, was pretty rough at release for the base consoles. The frame rate was not good, but that stuff is way better now. Probably the most impressive though is that they didn't create a performance or a graphics mode switcher. It just has 4K visuals, ray tracing, and 60 frames per second by default. And that's fairly unusual considering how good it runs now. It's not necessarily as strong as the ray tracing on PC, but wow, it looks way better than the base console version from the last generation. At number 19 is the Halo Master Chief Collection, which offers some pretty big improvements. Faster load times. That's probably, with this console generation, one of the prime advantages. But you also get 4K resolution, 120 frames per second, way better draw distances and an FOV slider. I mean, this game's a really good example of how even an older game can look a lot better on a next-gen console. The HDR can look a little funky sometimes, like it'll be a little too bright, but at certain moments, it looks really amazing. Also, it's not necessarily mind-blowing, but it is a big jump. At number 18 is Ghost of Tsushima. Now, the PS5 version is a director's cut, which gives you dynamic 4K and 60 frames per second. Honestly, for me, PlayStation 5 seems like the ideal platform because it's a game where parry timing is massively important, so that 60 frames per second speed is really, really vital. But some of the most amazing stuff you see in the upgrade is the lighting and texture detail. Like, the clothing is so outrageously detailed in this game. You can see little beads of sweat on people. Lighting feels way more dynamic and intense, and it just overall feels a lot sharper than the PS4 version, which, by the way, is a really gorgeous game as it is. At number 17 is Gears 5, which comes in running basically the equivalent of the PC version running at Ultra. You get 4K at 60 frames per second, shadows are way better, texture resolution's way better. I mean, it was already a good looking game on Xbox One, but I mean, look at the opening scenes showing off how much better this game actually looks. Gears 5 really is a good way to show off the difference between the last generation and this one. At number 16 is the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now this offers a couple of different modes. There's a PS5 graphics mode and a PS5 performance mode. At the PS4, you're at a dynamic 1620p resolution and you're locked at 30 frames per second. If you do PS5 graphics mode, you're at 4K at 30 frames per second. And if you do it in performance, it's 1440p at 60 frames per second. Now, this is a slightly lower resolution, obviously, but at 60 frames per second. This is a very fast-paced, frankly very pretty game that looks incredible at 60 frames per second. And while the PS5 upgrade is free, there is a DLC called Intergrade that does cost actual money, but it adds more content to the game as well. The graphical upgrades, you just have to own the game and a PS5 though. At number 15 is Monster Hunter World. Probably the biggest boost you get in this upgrade is the FPS. This game really benefits from the 60 frames per second gameplay. Also, frankly, the better load times are a really big one for me here. It's really noticeable the difference between like the Series X and the Xbox One version. Xbox One, you got 30 frames per second and it was really inconsistent. Series X, you get 60 and some minor and rare frames per second drops. PS5, you get it locked in at 60 frames per second with a better draw distance, better shadows. I mean, it's a big jump over the PlayStation 4 Pro, which has you generally bouncing back and forth between 30 and 40 frames per second. The resolution never actually gets up to 4K, but the game plays so much better, and it's so heavy on battling that the noticeable jump in frame rate is a big deal. At number 14 is Forza Horizon 4. I mean, it's a game that already looked great on Xbox One, but this update makes it look way better. You get improved reflections just right from the start, and it's very noticeable. Rain effects, particle effects, all of that stuff is way better as well. Draw distance. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of obvious pop-in the Xbox One version, but it's really, really good here. You get 4K resolution. You're pretty much locked in at 60 frames per second. It's a big jump on a frankly already incredible looking game. At number 13 is Days Gone, which on the PS4 Pro you would get checkerboard 4K and it was 30 frames per second, but you would get stutters. On PS5, you're getting a pretty sturdy 60 frames per second at a dynamic 4K, which is not full 4K all the time, but it still looks really good. Blurry textures were kind of a problem in the first game. I mean, not a huge one, but it's gone. So, I mean, everything looks a lot better. Pretty much everything in the world looks a lot better. They've also ironed out a lot of the weirdness, some of the jankiness. Not all of it, but it does look and feel way better to play at 60 frames per second. It's a pretty darn good looking game as it is. At number 12 is Evil Within 2. Now, this is a game that doesn't actually get any kind of graphical overhaul, but it just gets a big performance improvement. It's not necessarily an Xbox S optimized game. Instead, it is supposedly the same thing with some performance improvements. And to be frank, that's a big deal at 60 frames per second. It didn't really need patching or anything. It's just that the hardware is better. They didn't do anything. It does not up it to 4K or anything either. However, that 60 frames per second feels like a big improvement. Even though it's not massively necessary, the game just runs better. At number 11 is God of War, the rebooted version from 2018. On PS4 Pro, it was actually a pretty darn impressive game. You could play it at a pretty high resolution, locked at 30 frames per second, or you could play it at 1080p at 40 to 60 frames per second. I mean, it would dip up and down. On PS5, you play it in 4K checkerboard resolution with the frame rate locked at 60. I mean, it looks much sharper, but the game already looked fantastic. There's little details that you can notice in this game, and also it's not like a super fast-paced game. It doesn't feel like it needs the 60 frames per second, but wow, does it feel smooth. At number 10 is Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which between the PS4 and PS4 Pro, there was a big resolution jump, as well as slightly higher frame rates, and we retained that resolution jump, as well as a lock at 60 frames per second on the PS5. The interesting thing is it actually takes a little bit of time getting used to, because you might have muscle memory from the slower frame rate, although the 60 frames per second feels a lot better in general. That is very hard to go back to a less stable frame rate. It makes a big difference. At number 9 is Battlefield 1, which benefits from a big jump out of a dynamic 1080p, which would often drop to 900p, all the way up to a dynamic 1800C resolution, locked at 60 frames per second. Like pretty much all the Battlefield games look better on next gen, but this one stands out. The improved resolution isn't 4K, but it locks at 60 frames per second, and everything, the particle effects, terrain, textures, it all just looks really good. Maybe not quite as good as playing it on a really powerful PC, but it's actually pretty close. At number 8 is Ninja Gaiden Black, which was enhanced for next generation consoles at the emulator level. I mean, it's an obviously old game, but it looks really good in 4K. It runs natively in 4K, and that's really impressive. The menus and the cutscenes are really low resolution, but everything else is in 4K, and it looks better than ever. In fact, better than the recent re-release, at least how it looked when it first came out. It only output to 2K resolution at first. This is probably the best way to play the definitive version of this classic action game, and it's a lot cheaper than buying the collection, and the collection isn't as good, honestly. And number 7 is Infamous Second Son, which gets a nice boost on FPS as well as the PS4 Pro and PS5 enhanced versions getting way better particle effects. On PS5, just play it on graphics mode. You don't even need performance mode. With the improved hardware, you're pretty much locked at 60 frames per second anyways. It does show its age with the lower quality textures, but otherwise it looks really good. It still has incredible effects, and that consistent frame rate is really nice. At number 6 is Hitman from 2016, which I particularly like. Hitman 3 included a lot of new effects and they backported them to the other 2 games. So not only do you get better resolution and frame rate, you get better lighting, better reflections, better shading, screen space reflections, etc. There's cloth physics that weren't there on certain objects. There is kind of a weird trade-off in that the 60 frames per second is only the backwards compatible version, or you get the upgraded effects and stuff, and that is locked at 30. Even though I don't really think the 60 frames per second makes a lot of difference in this game, it's a slow-paced game by nature, and it looks gorgeous. At number 5 is Control on the PS5. I mean, it's a big jump. 60 frames per second with no drops versus last gen's 30 with drops and much lower resolution. The annoying thing is that the upgrade cost money. It was free on PS Plus for a month, but if you didn't get it that month, the only way to get the PS5 improvements was to pay for it. But I mean, between the ray tracing that's added and the 60 frames per second boost, it's already worth it. But they also have the very fast PS5 near none loading time thing. There's almost no texture pop in. Action feels responsive. Gameplay is fast and fun. The particle effects are actually a lot better too. Way more physics objects flying around. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good version of the game for next gen. That said, switching from performance to graphics mode is pretty jarring. It's kind of like playing the game in slow motion, but if you get used to it, the 30 frames per second is consistent and the ray tracing effects are still some of the best out there. At number 4 is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, which gets an okay resolution bump, but it's really the frame rate that gets the bump. On the PS4 Pro, you're playing at 1080p. On the PS5, you're playing at 1200p, which is not quite 2K even. But rather than going up and down between 45 and 50 frames per second, you're pretty much locked at 60. And you don't have that weird stuttering that happened in loading zones. There's much faster loading times, textures look way better, and it's an action game, so while it's not perfect, playing this thing at 60 frames per second is of course really good. And the higher resolution does make things look better. It's not just resolution though, they do improve the lighting quite a bit, and it's nice. It's really nice. And number 3 is Rainbow Six Siege. This is probably one of the only games that allows you to disable VSync on console. It doesn't actually have any next-gen updates or unique settings, but because it can have a totally unlocked frame rate, the power of the Series X can really boost the frame rate. On the Xbox One X, you would get between 60 and 70 frames per second on average, but with the Series X, unlocking the frame rate can get it running at up to even 135 frames per second, only in PvE. But still, it does not get the 4K resolution, but that improved frame rate is really nice. It doesn't get quite that high in multiplayer, but it's very high. At number 2 is Just Cause 3. Anyone who played this game on previous generation consoles knows that it was pretty much unplayable at the frame rate it ran at. Compared to how great Just Cause 2 ran on 360, it was kind of shocking how bad the sequel played. 30 frames per second with drops doesn't sound terrible, but the drops were quite frequent. But with Series X, it is possible to play at a stable frame rate. It's still not incredible. It's locked at 30 with a 1080p resolution, but it just works as intended, which is very nice. It was not playable. There was so much dropping of frames, it was ridiculous. It's quite nice though, just to have a game that was infamous for frame rate problems finally at least stable, even if only at 30. And finally at number 1, it's Grand Theft Auto 4. So you don't get any resolution bump, which kinda sucks, but this game ran like crap on the Xbox 360, and now it locks at 60 frames per second. You're talking like sub 30 frames per second to locked at 60. There is auto HDR, which does make it look a little better, but sometimes it can weird glow stuff. Like, I don't know how to really describe it. It's not natural looking, but generally it does look a little bit better, but playing this game is what feels better. It is so nice to see it locked at 60 frames per second compared to how this game used to run. That's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is of course a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon Hero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.